So welcome back, everyone. It's good to see so many of you in the room. Before I turn the floor over to our keynote speakers with some fireworks, I wanted to take just a minute to step back and reflect on what we've heard yesterday. We started the day with Susan Athey, the chief economist at the DOJ. She made the point that going to court with machine learning-based evidence is a great litigation strategy, which came as a surprise to many of us. This was very refreshing. So Susan, once again, thank you so very much for that great introduction to the third annual conference. Then we've heard from Rebecca Williams and Bill Kovacic. They discussed the future of computational antitrust. They talked about the need for antitrust agencies to systematically document their past activities in order to better shape future policy. They discussed how to educate lawyers about computer science, whether in the classroom, at the university, or within competition agencies. And they concluded with some remarks on automated antitrust litigation. And then we've heard from 4 different competition agencies in the agency carousel. They presented their progress in computational antitrust, and they showed that the topic is not only academic, but also very practical. And we ended the day with a panel on AI with 4 scholars discussing the legal framework for antitrust agencies to rely more heavily on machine learning. Today, we have a great program with a keynote in just a minute, a panel discussing results achieved with computational tools, a computational carousel with 2 demos from companies, and a grande finale with 1 academic, 1 technical expert, and 2 globally recognized practitioners discussing computational antitrust. All right, on to our keynotes. So Glen and Zoe are co-authors, and they have prepared a talk about what a whole new direction for antitrust might look like. This new direction involves computational power. That's all I know. And I'm as equally excited as you are right now. Now, here is Glen's official bio, and then I'll give a less official bio. The official one is that he is the the founder and the research director of the Microsoft Research Special Project, the Plural Technology Collaboratory. He is also the founder of Radical Exchange, and he is the founder and chair of the Plurality Institute. He is the senior advisor to the Getting Plurality Research Network at Harvard University. Now, less officially, Glen is one, if not my favorite thinkers to get on the phone with, which I know is very specific, but let me tell you why that is. Whenever I get a chance to spend 30 minutes with Glen on the phone, I leave the call with many great ideas for my papers, pointed comments, and not just food for thought, but a whole buffet of thoughts. So I'm very much looking forward to today's keynote for that precise reason. On his side is Zoe. She is a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Her current research focuses on privacy and transparency in markets, contracts, and other forms of communication. She received her PhD in economics from Harvard University in 2023, so congratulations. And she holds a MPhil in history and philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. Now, maybe less officially, although this information is on our website, Zoe is also a poet. And so, of course, I had to explore that a little bit this morning. And I thought that everyone would enjoy just a second of our poetry before diving into more brutal topics. So here we go. I'll try my best. I used to envy the trees wearing mists as veils, modest trunks exploding into thousands of muscle-bound legs soon as they reached the soil. Now even trees seems docile and susceptible, which I thought was very beautiful. So on that note, to both of you, thank you so very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Thibaut. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to give the presentation. Zoe will field the questions. But this is joint work in progress, building on previous work that we did called Economic Democracy and Market Power. And it's going to be a little bit different than what Thibaut described. It's a little bit less methodologically focused in the sense of evidence gathering, and a little bit more methodologically focused in terms of how we can use computational tools to reimagine antitrust remedies and interventions. And it's inspired, despite the fact that it's, we're going to try to give a bit of a new approach, by something very old. So, going back to John Sherman, antitrust was originally an anti-monarchical project. Sherman said that if we would not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production of the transport, production, or sale of any of the necessities of life. And, there have been different approaches. There were, at the inception, different approaches to how to counter monarchy in this way. The one that's been most, discussed and popular recently is kind of the populist approach, associated with people like Williams Jennings Bryan and Louis Brandeis, that really focused on this Jeffersonian tradition of avoiding and breaking up concentrations of power. A second approach that's associated with kind of the progressives, people like Teddy Roosevelt, and the progressive intellectuals, was one of using democratic political power to sort of co-opt and control these concentrations of private power. Sometimes they used breakups, but the real goal was to achieve regulation, maybe even nationalization, to subordinate those concentrations of private power to democratic nation states. Walter Lippmann is perhaps one of the people most associated with this, had a great influence on the New Deal. But there's a third tradition that I think is often forgotten, but equally, if not more important, associated with people like Henry George and John Dewey. And the vision there was neither, make the democratic nation state supreme nor break up power. It was instead to constitute new constellations of democratic accountability associated with the new technological possibilities opened up. This is associated with the utilities and municipalization movements, with the labor movement. It was perhaps best expressed in this wonderful book by John Dewey called The Public and Its Problems, in which he argued that new technologies create new forms of interdependence, and the principle underlying democracy is not nation states. It's really the notion that interdependence should be self-governing, that the people who are subject to the power created by new forms of interdependence should be the people who have the say on controlling the direction that interdependence evolves. And that in order, therefore, Dewey argued, for interdependence and democracy to survive, neither of the other two options are really viable, because technology creates these new forms of interdependence only by creating new publics, new polities that could democratically govern these can we actually have democracy. Because these new forms of interdependence don't follow exactly nation-state lines. So simply subjecting them to democratic oversight in the nation-state sense does not actually achieve the substantive goals of democracy, which are that the actual interdependence is governed by the people who are subject to that interdependence. And the economics of this are actually incredibly simple, much more simple even than the Chicago school tradition. They are almost mechanically obvious, and yet they're much more radical than that tradition. In particular, monopolies, the problem is they internalize their profits. They don't internalize the surplus of their counterparties, of consumers, workers, or people who are the subject of externalities. And if there is a way, by changing the corporate governance, by changing who is in charge of the corporation and to what it is accountable, you can incorporate those unincorporated surpluses, then without having to give up the benefits of economies of scale, without having to have one nation state intervene in an international market, you could, at least in principle, constitute a new accountability structure that avoids the harms that are associated with market power. So this is an extremely, extremely simple economic idea, but very radical. It would require fundamentally rethinking the way that corporations are accountable, operate, and reimagine corporate governance as a remedy for market power. But there's huge problems in making this happen, and there really have been since Dewey's time, and ones he talked about at length. You have to identify who are these stakeholders, how do you quantify and define them? And even if you can sort of in some technocratic or objective way define them, how do they organize themselves given that they're distributed all around the world? You know, creating a polity in a country, think about like what the European Union has been trying to do, even within well-defined states that have had relationships with each other for years, trying to make themselves think of themselves as a polity, organize political parties, find people who represent them. This is an incredibly difficult thing to achieve in a distributed set of people subject to the power of a technological platform. Then these people need to find a way to communicate with each other, to reach political decisions, to come up with common understandings, to set an agenda, and eventually to make collective decisions, especially in an environment where, for a commercial product or for workers, different people will be subject to the power of these companies to different extent. How do you even quantify that? How do you get a sense of who thinks what? All these things are super challenging. And we've seen these problems play out in practice. Companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, there's recently been quite a lot of news about the way in which they've tried to set up a governance structure so that they're accountable to more than shareholders, so they're accountable to some notion of the common good. And I don't think all of these experiments have been entirely successful, partly because of some of these problems that we've been talking about. How one actually make something in a meaningful and responsible way accountable to something other than shareholders. But I actually think this is one area where technology has a lot to do to help. And this is what plurality is all about. Technology offers ways increasingly for people to connect across very potentially diverse physical situations and backgrounds. Potentially, this can be gated and quantified using some of the technologies that you guys have been talking about for the last couple of days. There are platforms like Polis that allow people to deliberate and reach respectful, common understandings across differences, find consensual points to move forward on in a way that traditional social media has not succeeded in doing. LLMs offer the possibility for people to do this much more quickly, much more responsively, in much more detail with much less individual attention that might have been unrealistic for them to supply in other times. There are new voting techniques that allow in a much more natural and continuous way for people with varying degrees of stake or interest in a topic to express these differing degrees of stake or interest while still having a baseline of kind of democratic equality. And these tools are not just theoretical, they're increasingly being used. They've helped transform Taiwan into the world's most successful digital democracy under the leadership of Audrey Tong, the world's first digital transgender minister, who came out of an Occupy movement that occupied their national legislature for 3 weeks, but used these tools to build consensus so that she became the first Occupy leader to become a minister in a government. And there is a large civic technology movement that's addressed problems from the pandemic to misinformation, major policy questions. And these tools are increasingly making their way back into the governance of these AI platforms through OpenAI's democratic inputs to AI project and Anthropic's collective writing of their constitutional AI recently. And I think that this potentially offers a really exciting alternative approach to coping with market power, rather than on breakups or allowing market power to run rampant. Instead, one can think about changing the ownership structure, harnessing some of these tools, and holding companies accountable for being up with the state of the art in terms of what's possible as a way of, as an intervention for mergers, for monopolization, et cetera. Now, there are some major limits to what antitrust is not so good at dealing with. It is focused on consumers and workers, commercial counterparties, not externalities, disinformation, biorisk, et cetera, pollution. Those have to be dealt with through other mechanisms, possibly also ways of bringing stakeholders into the process. But antitrust doesn't have the tools to directly address that, but it does, what it does have that's quite powerful is ways to directly quantify the stake that different consumer groups have. And especially with the types of computational tools that you all are talking about, this becomes highly heterogeneous, highly rich, gives us a real sense of the types of individuals who are subject to what degree of power, and therefore should be included in representation schemes that are empowered by these more flexible digital participation tools. Therefore, I think it's really exciting to imagine how antitrust, rather than just treating all companies, whether nonprofit or however organized, the same, can instead try to steer the development in a way that's consistent with the things that are already evolving, but combats the natural tendency of the markets to instead collapse everything to just a simplistic, corporate structure, and instead can, both in terms of where interventions occur and what the shape of those interventions are, consider the nature of the accountability of the organization and try to steer that accountability in directions that are already being explored by the industry in ways that create an incentive for and pressure towards inclusive, digitally empowered stakeholder governance. And this is part of a broader plurality movement that I'm involved in, that was really inspired by Audrey Tong, Taiwan's digital minister. In Mandarin, in the traditional Mandarin that they use in Taiwan, the characters shown on this picture for plural and digital are the same. And so there's this tradition of developing technology to empower pluralism and participatory governance. And we represent that by these overlapping squares, which are a Unicode character. And we develop everything as part of an open source participative process. Welcome all of you to join in that, become co-creators, co-authors, recognized collaborators on the project. And if that interests you, check out this QR code, which has a bunch of ways to connect to us. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn over to Zoe to answer questions and stop my sharing. Actually, I guess I'll leave it up there just in case anyone wants to see it.
All right, thank you so much. So questions will come in the chat. I see one already. Maybe let me abuse my position of power here and start with two questions that I had. The first question is, what maybe more of a technical question and then more of an institutional question. The first one on the technical side is whether or not you see blockchain playing a role, especially in the governance of those, whether AI companies or AI system.
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. Certainly, Web3 and blockchain systems can be a valuable way of attributing stakes to a collective project. And so, insofar as those tools have developed in the blockchain and Web3 space, I think those tools are absolutely applicable. I mean, whether those are, whether those really harness the true value of blockchain as a trustless network is another question. But certainly, one of the most exciting innovations that came out of the explosion of interest in blockchain was the idea of the DAO, the idea of a cooperative social endeavor where different people have different kinds of voting rights in line with their interests. And so, insofar as those tools have been developed in that space, absolutely, they can be applied and brought into the sorts of questions that we're talking about today.
And so this actually brings my second question, which is the expertise that you would need within competition agencies, right? So I understand this is not just for competition agencies, but if they have a role to play, which kind of expertise do you think they would need to acquire in order to do it well, right? To understand what they do and they indeed enforce those remedies.
Yeah, the question of enforcement here, I think, is a huge one, and one that we're starting to think about. I think that one of the key forms of expertise, I mean, there's one level on which you might think that there's a high level of expertise required to make any of these systems enforceable or enforced. On the other hand, there are ways that we can think about in which the company itself is not the one that is running the democratic processes, and there might be a sort of third party or some kind of self-governed DAO or decentralized group that is in charge of the democratic processes, so that there's not necessarily a burden on the antitrust authorities or the competition authorities to understand what the firm is doing, but rather they can trust the group that is collectively determining their own questions because it's in that group's interest to collectively determine itself. So there are interesting questions about, the burden of enforcement, and also which groups of people who have stake in this firm have different kinds of incentives to truthfully represent how they're collectively governing.
One thing I would just add is one type of expertise that I think would be really important would be corporate governance expertise, which is not a traditional focus in antitrust authorities, as well as expertise in some of these digital tools that empower more creative forms of corporate governance. So,
yeah, thanks so much. I'll put the link to your QR code in the chat right now for everyone to just access, and I will stop sharing your screen so we can see you actually. Yes, like this. All right, perfect. So yes, all right, you're back. So not to make your life any easier, we covered technical aspect, institutional aspect, and now some maybe more substantial aspects of antitrust. One question we have in the chat is whether or not you see concrete adjustments needed in order for what you propose to fit within the antitrust framework, right? So again, not making your life any easier here.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know exactly what the differences would have to be, but I think there's some degree to which the theoretical underpinnings, as Glen pointed out throughout the talk, the theoretical underpinnings of the whole idea of antitrust really do naturally point to the kinds of solutions that we've been talking about. And those theoretical underpinnings, as Glen touched on, are really fundamentally about the fact that the key problem with a monopoly is that it doesn't internalize externalities of its stakeholders. And so on a really basic level, if we look at the whole point of antitrust and what it's trying to do, what it was set up to do back in the day, it really does directly point to this idea that people, if there's an effective form of collective governance, then that is a natural remedy to the kinds of market power that monopolies and so forth can come about. Now, what that means for the actual practice and precedent and so forth, I think will defer to the lawyers.
Yeah, I would to follow up on what the practical aspects might potentially be. One is there's a long tradition of treating nonprofits differently in antitrust. This happens in hospital issues. This happens with the Major League Baseball, many different things when there's a social interest. And trying to rigorously define notions of accountability to stakeholders and then make those criteria for differing treatment, I think would be very valuable. And the second aspect would be to consider as a non-structural remedy or a quasi-structural remedy the changing of stake or the empowerment of counterparties that could have power over the firm, like labor unions.
And so when you're talking about remedies, do you have in mind this kind of remedies in the antitrust sense of the term, meaning I see a practice and I intervene only when I see a practice, or would you also envision that this could work ex ante, right? So you would intervene just based on a monopoly position without any practice in specifics?
Sorry, I don't think I understood the last piece of your question.
So I guess my point is, whether or not this will only apply ex post, meaning I spot a practice which is anti-competitive in the sense of antitrust, and then I impose what you propose as a remedy, or would it also work without any infringement of antitrust, but just, intervening on the market based on other criteria?
It's a great question. I think that, well, first I'd say that I would hope that in a world where this is initially used as an antitrust remedy, then firms that seem to be amassing large market power in order to avoid an antitrust suit would start to adopt these kinds of procedures and may even see the benefits of these forms of collective governance without any sort of remedy or need coming from an external agency.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, but I also think that, look, we're talking this is an antitrust audience. They have certain tools available to them. The things that Zoe are talking about, those are great. But what people on this call can actually probably do is impose remedies at the stage of conduct. So I think, part of the message is for regulators, part of this message is for antitrust enforcers, part of this message is for people at companies trying to avoid problem with regulators. And I think it's a potential solution in all those three contexts. So
yeah. So one more question in the chats, which I think is, I like because this is thinking outside of the box, but we always come back to this idea of a box, and here more specifically of a black box. And I guess I will turn the question a bit differently. The question is whether or not you see concerns regarding the black box of AI and the lack of transparency, or at least, the ability to understand. But my question would be, if policymakers are to use AI in their remedies, the fact that indeed they cannot always, especially some policymakers with just, we have antitrust agencies with just 10 employees. So those agencies won't be in a position to fully understand the functioning of AI. And if there is a black box issue, is it a limit to what you are proposing, or is it not?
Yeah, I think that the black box issues with AI are real challenges, but are not necessarily impediments to democratic oversight or participation, because to a large extent, the black box issues apply to anyone interacting with the system, not just to external people. Now, of course, non-disclosures of source data, there's a lot trickier issues there. But there are plenty of things that are black boxes that are democratically governed. We didn't reveal nuclear secrets, and yet we had, a democratic government determining how those nuclear weapons were going to be used. So, and we saw with the constitutional AI for Anthropic, you can have democratic participation in writing a constitution that are instructions given to a black box algorithm. So I definitely think the black box issue is an important issue and a challenge in a lot of different ways, but I'm not sure it is particularly an impediment to the capacity to have democratic accountability, at least somewhere in the chain.
I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of the, there's a lot of rhetoric today that emphasizes the black box nature of AI. And some of that rhetoric comes from the very people who have an interest in maintaining a kind of mysticism or mystery about how these systems work. And their incentive to maintain that mystery is coming from their desire to not be understood and not be regulated in the ways that we're talking about today and you've been talking about throughout the conference.
Yeah, I see that sometimes going to some conferences where, the main message is it's all complicated, which is true, but it doesn't mean that we cannot comprehend the subject. Okay, one final question. You've mentioned Taiwan, and I know, Glen, you're going to be there very soon. What can you learn from their experience in actually successfully, doing something similar or that is actually inspiring to you into, maybe trying to transpose that into antitrust, or to put it differently, what have they done so that it lifted the box of being just an idea to something they've done in practice? What was the secret for them?
I mean, I think there's many things at play there. One is a sense of threat from geopolitical scenarios and the mobilization of civil society that came with that. Another was, an exceptional group of very civic-minded people who are grounded in a tradition there where civil society has played a huge role, even back to the dictatorship. Mobilizing that civic society, connecting it to the technology was critical. And those things are often very separated in the US. There's like a tech sector that doesn't get very involved with civil society. There's a activist civil society sector that maybe harnesses Twitter, but doesn't really think about the design of technology. So connecting those things up are very powerful. And my hope is that if we tell the story in the right way, if we dramatize it for people, if we make people feel palpably that sense of threat and possibility of connection, that some of that fabric will be created and empower something similar to happen in, say, the US and Europe.
Yeah, all right. Well, on that, I think creating a sense of threat is a good way where to end this conversation. So to both of you, thank you so very much. Again, I knew this would be not just food for thought, but a whole buffet of that, and this is definitely what we got. So thank you so much for the keynote and answering the questions. I hope to see you soon in person, and we move on to the next panel.